I recently saw some incredible level design from user Eugenia Lisa that reinterpreted Sailor Moon as a dark fantasy, something out of Dark Souls. The level, created in the Unreal Engine, depicts the Moon Kingdom as an overgrown, crumbling ruin of its former self, something lost to time and memory. This is honestly not too much unlike how the Moon Kingdom is in the original Sailor Moon anime, with it slowly decaying on the surface of the moon, a cold, dark surface devoid of light, completely abandoned on the dark side of a moon, completely abandoned following the Great War between the Moon Kingdom and Queen Beryl's forces. Which begs the question, what would Sailor Moon be like if it became a dark fantasy? Something more in line with Dark Souls or Glenn Cook's The Black Company. This creative exercise will use the level design by Eugenia as a source of inspiration, a jumping off point, but it will expand to include the entirety of the Sailor Moon story, all the domains established in the anime, all the locations, all the characters, and a little bit of the manga too. This is a purely hypothetical creative exercise, one meant not to be a replacement for Sailor Moon or say what went wrong with Sailor Moon. No, it's just gonna be a little bit of fun. That's all it is. Just a spot of fun, so don't take it too seriously. Don't act like I'm saying the Sailor Moon anime is bad or anything. I adore it. But one thing I think we can accomplish through this exercise is explore what makes the magical girl genre so distinct? What makes it unique? What makes it compelling? And by comparing it to this more mainstream fantasy genre, we can determine, oh hey, here's why it works. So first off, what is dark fantasy and how is it different from what Sailor Moon already is? Dark fantasy is fantasy that deals with darker ideas and themes. I mean, yeah, obviously, right? It's often a little more cynical, focusing on either pain, sacrifice, or decay. Now, a common misconception is that it's just fantasy with horror, but while most horror fantasy is also dark fantasy, not all dark fantasy is horror. Often dark fantasy deals with either the twilight years of a civilization, how magic or the world itself can cause decay, or exploration of a world long past its due date. I think that the Elric saga by Michael Moorcock is a great example of dark fantasy. The titular Elric starts his journey as a prince, witnessing the collapse of his civilization, Melniboné. He's a frail man, given great power due to his knowledge of sorcery and his magical sword, Stormbringer, which once drawn cannot be sheathed until it feasts upon blood, and also the soul of whoever's blood is drawn. While at first it appears that Elric is wielding Stormbringer for power, it quickly becomes apparent that it's the sword wielding Elric to feast on the souls of all that live throughout all reality. Tragedy befalls Elric wherever he goes, right down to his lovers facing sometimes grotesque and nightmarish transformations, in part due to Elric's own actions. And in the end of the day, well, let's just say it does not end all that well for Elric. Now, for this creative exercise, I want to impose a few rules for myself. For one, I cannot change the core personalities of any of the characters as introduced. As the story progresses, the characters may change just organically based on what alterations we make to the story. So Usagi, she's still 14 years old, still a crybaby, still loves her friends, etc. Those core characteristics at the start of the story remain the same, but I can't guarantee they'll stay that way as we shift the narrative. Now, secondly, I want to follow the arcs as they occur in the anime. We start with Queen Beryl in the Dark Kingdom, then move on to the Dark Moon Clan and Doom Phantom. We go to the Deathbusters in Pharaoh 90, the Dead Moon Circus with Nehelenia, and finally, we end the show with Shadow Galaxia and Queen Galaxia, as well as Chaos.
Chaos, chaos. I want to kill chaos.
However, the circumstances Sailor Moon will find herself in will change from point to point as we continue. And further, I don't want to completely upend the lore of the series. It would be easy to just make Sailor Moon into Madoka and call it a day. But we're not doing that. Madoka, don't worry about it. We're not going to do that. We're not taking the easy way out. We're making Sailor Moon dark. but we're not turning it into something else. We're not turning it into a D&D campaign, etc. I don't want to change the core of the plot more than necessary. For the record, I will be following the anime's plot rather than the manga's because, well, the manga's already plenty dark to begin with, and I think there's a lot of flexibility with the anime's plot that could be fun to play around with and explore. That being said, though, I will be lifting where necessary or interesting from the manga. I will not go through the entire episode by episode changes I would make, just the parts I would change personally, and I'm going to talk in broad strokes, because otherwise, I mean, look, the show's 200 episodes long. We'd be here all day if it was an episode by episode rewrite, and frankly, I think that's less interesting than discussing the overall wide changes I'd make along the way. So before we get really started with the smaller details, let's get some broad changes taken care of first. For one, all of the monsters, they're going to be more terrifying. Now, some of the monsters in Sailor Moon are quite disturbing already, like that ghoul that replaces Naru's mom in the first episode, but as the show goes on, we get more gimmicks, more silliness, cuter monsters based on cute household items, or maybe a certain theme of the episode. But let's make the monsters more horrific, more centered on certain themes that may be run throughout each season. In the first arc, for example, the Sailor Guardians fight the Dark Kingdom, an ancient civilization risen from the grave. Therefore, the monsters should be more undead, rotten, broken ghouls from a dark, long since past era, roused to life forcibly by both Queen Beryl and Metalia. Now, the second season focuses on both Allie and En, as well as the Dark Moon Clan, which both are more science fiction themed, adversaries. Allie and En are, of course, aliens from outside the solar system, whereas the Dark Moon Clan inhabit another planet entirely. So Allie and En draw from the constellations, so the monsters should be more nightmarish reimaginings of the Greek constellations, crossed with some sci-fi horror. Think Dark Souls bosses, essentially. On the other hand, the Dark Moon Clan, being from the distant future and from another planet, should feature mechanized weapons, more Terminator than pure magic, instilled maybe with Magitech aesthetics. The Deathbusters, from the third season, aim to summon entities from beyond the galaxy, which means Lovecraftian. The Dead Moon Circus, well, make them circus-themed monsters like in the original, except more geared for horror. The Amazon Trio, being animals turned into people, should be less beautiful humans and more like something taken out of the island of Dr. Moreau. And finally, Sailor Galaxia. Her army? They're Sailor soldiers that are enslaved to Galaxia's will after being conquered, and so naturally, the common enemy should be foes who have been completely broken by their experiences, forced to work with evil will, shadows of Sailor Moon and friends that represent what would happen to them if they ever submitted to the horrors that they have faced across this reimagined series. With Season 1, the characters should start off in roughly the same spot as they start off. One change I will make, though, is that each season would take place over a slightly longer period of time. Rather than a half year for each season, it's going to take a full year. So each character would age a year per arc. So Usagi starts off at 14. In the original anime, this show ends at 16 and a half, roughly. But in this revised version, the series would end with her as a 19-year-old woman. The Dark Moon Kingdom, in the first arc, they're trying to harvest energy from pure souls in order to restore their master, Queen Metalia. However, rather than just wear people down and make them tired, let's say, these drained souls now would be husks of energy. They would be withering, ill, and maybe, in some extreme cases, die. This makes the stakes far more extreme from the beginning. It puts everything on edge. The Sailor Guardians, in this sense, should be less superheroes and more like the gang from the Persona series, like 4 or 5 specifically, investigating a series of horrific deaths. This adds a further element of horror to both Jadeite and Nephrite's antics, who both collect energy, in Jadeite's case, from large groups of people at once, in Nephrite's case, the more personal grooming, I guess for lack of a better word, of individuals to surrender their energy to him. usually in pursuit of a dream or a goal. This would be very horrific. Series of deaths unexplained, bunch of people getting sick and ill. It adds stakes, and it creates this sense of investigation that would require the Guardians to act outside of their combat capabilities as heroes, as well as within. And it also gives Ami a lot more to do, which is cool. More specifically, Ami in the original anime tends to have more of a supporting role. She tends to offer solutions using her computer, using her investigative skills. In this case, if we move more into the realm of investigation, Ami would have a more valuable role to contribute as a planner, as someone who investigates, which would put into contrast Usagi's more assertive, more direct approach. It would allow us to distinguish the two characters a little bit more and add value to the team. In combat situations when Sailor Moon is dominating the bad guy, it sometimes feels like the other characters are tertiary. In this new format, it would give Ami more value outside of combat. I think one key thing is I would like to move the series away from just fights every episode, and more into the girls exploring and using their gifts in a way that audiences could feel they could actually do in real life. It makes the characters more grounded, and it also makes the characters in some regards very relatable. Now, in this case, yes, Naru would still have a relationship with Nephrite, and that would still flow in much the same way, but because people are dying, I think it would add a much darker tinge to the whole narrative. And it should end the same way, with Zoisite killing Nephrite, but I want to make a change right here. Naru should also die. Nephrite and Naru should both perish at the same time. After all, Naru already serves less a role in the anime as it goes on. We're not changing too much if something horrible happens to her. And indeed, it does explain why Usagi barely talks about Naru after season 1. This leads to another issue I have with the whole series, death. In the original anime, death becomes sort of a revolving door where characters are killed off and are brought back shortly thereafter, and usually to a degree of regularity, especially at big seasons like the first season or final season. I feel like it should have a little more weight to it. Death should be more permanent. Not entirely permanent, but slightly more permanent. There should be a way to bring people back from the dead, but it should be at incredible cost. And we see that in the series already. The 4 Guardians of the Dark Moon Kingdom, Jadeite, Nephrite, Zoisite, and Kunzite, all of them had died in the past, but were brought back. And in this case, what I think should happen is their resurrection should result in suffering. They should remember the trauma of their perishing and of their rebirth, and that should scar them in some way, twist them and gnarl them into something unnatural. All the main characters should have phantom memories of their past lives, brought into painful focus when they finally learn the full extent of who they are. Before that, it could be dreams, it could be weird cases of deja vu, but when they are in the relics of the Moon Kingdom, or given relics of the Moon Kingdom, it should come into focus, and the trauma of that should hurt. Zoisite's arc should follow a very similar structure to the original anime, with finding the 7 shards of the shield. With finding the 7 shards of the silver crystal, and both Usagi and Tuxedo Mask separately trying to collect the shards. The difference here should be how the various souls, who are the reincarnations of the 7 great Yoma who serve the Dark Kingdom in the old era, should go. The transformations should be brutal, intense, more akin to Akira or a werewolf transformation than the simple, smooth, magical, flip a switch kind of transformation we see in the show proper, with Usagi struggling to bring back the people from their transformed states. And I think that some should be impossible to bring back, with Usagi trying new ways to find a solution to the problem. While I do think that Usagi should still have the power to restore the transformed, I think that she should fail at least the first couple of times, with her finally figuring it out proper when it's Amy's love interest who's transformed, causing Amy a serious injury, especially if it leaves a scar that would remain there for the rest of the series, perhaps a deep gash to her leg or even face, or, more extreme, a permanent physical disability, perhaps a chunk of leg missing, a fractured spinal column, paralysis from the waist down. Since she's more support than true offense, she can still fight, she can still be there, but it would set her more apart from everyone else. especially if she uses her knowledge of medicine, or her pursuit to learn medicine as a doctor, to maybe find a workaround to her injury, perhaps giving herself some augmentations in the process, similar to what happens with Sailor Saturn in the original manga. This also ties in with something, I think, that more of the Guardians should be physically different from one another. I think, for example, Jupiter should be broader and taller and maybe a little, more muscular and athletic. Usagi could be slightly fuller figured, maybe a little visibly shorter, if only because that would make them each stand out slightly more among each other. And as the show goes on, we can see them physically change more and more. And that difference can put more into contrast how their experiences have reshaped them. Now, the arc would culminate in traveling to the Moon Kingdom, seeing the ruins of what was, to unlock their original memories, before they go to the Dark Kingdom and fight Metalia and Beryl and all that in the Antarctica. So that is to say, going to the ruins of the Moon Kingdom before going to the re-inhabited ruins of the Dark Kingdom. While in the original series this takes place over the course of a couple episodes, I think the entire final portion of this season should be spent exploring the old ruins ravaged by time and war, as well as recalling memories once lost. And that should put into context what we've seen as hallucinations or visions up until this point. I also think that all of the Sailor Guardians and Tuxedo Mask, like in the original series, should be killed off. Maybe under different circumstances, however, like fighting Kunzite, one of them can die. Venus can take down Queen Beryl with the sword like she does in the manga, then perish. But at the end of the day, Sailor Moon defeats Metalia, and then Sailor Moon restores them by briefly harnessing both the powers of the Silver Crystal and the same darkness that Metalia used to bring back the Dark Kingdom. And what that will do is get the ball rolling on a very interesting idea that I want to see throughout the series. Now, this touches upon something that is present in the original series. Usagi and the others between seasons 1 and 2 forget that they're Sailor Guardians, as sort of an act of mercy, to keep them from remembering the trauma of fighting for truth and justice and what comes as a result of that fight. That trauma is mostly glossed over after the start of the second arc, but I think if we're reinterpreting the series as a dark fantasy, that dynamic should play a huge role. Trauma, how war affects you, that's heavy stuff, and should really influence the characters and their growth. Now, one thing of note is that both Mars and Venus already have one foot in the world of darkness already, with Venus serving as a guardian for some time before joining the rest, dealing with some heavy stuff. On the other hand, Mars has ties to the supernatural and thus connection to the world of the dead. This, I feel, should be a factor moving forward, especially if Mars comes back to life. Her ties to the afterlife should result in her being able to sense and detect the spirits of the deceased in a more explicit fashion. Throughout the series, she should be able to pick up on the very old souls of the Dark Kingdom to uncover secret knowledge about their abilities, or perhaps information that the characters aren't present for. Her pet ravens could even potentially be part of her ensemble, accompanying her into battle, potentially as a means of espionage or sight. Or, even more so, her ability to freeze people with talisman can be expanded upon. Potentially, she could create force fields, defensive areas upon which the enemies might have trouble penetrating. She could be a very interesting member of the support team along with Mercury in that sense, who'd use technology, perhaps augmented by the supernatural, in order to best support Usagi. By differentiating what each girl can do and bring to the table, it also would expand their practicality in the conflicts of the story. This also means that, so far, Sailor Jupiter is the least traumatized of the bunch. Don't worry, we'll get to you later, Mako. No one leaves this place unscathed. So, the next arc deals with Ali and En, as well as the Dark Moon Clan. Again, this would go much the same way. Usagi restores her friend's memories in order to fight Ali and En. Their big alien tree would probably have more disturbing negative impacts on the environment, as it offers life to the two aliens. I think the tree would have almost a bloodborne impact on everything, making Tokyo a verifiable hellscape. But once Ali and En are handled in much the same way they are in the original series, we'd get to the Dark Moon Clan, which would deal entirely with time travel and the negativity of an overly optimistic, sterile future. See, the whole plot of Sailor Moon R focuses on the Dark Moon Clan being a group of people banished from Neo Queen Serenity's kingdom, where people live forever, ageless. That's the canon of the original anime. Everything seems perfect in this original anime timeline. However, if we're rewriting it, if we're redrafting it, we should tease the idea of a dark future created with good intentions, crafted by Usagi herself. See, in our rewrite so far, she brought her friends back to life, dragging her companions back from the grave into the fight. Yes, to save the world, to live, but it would cost personal pain. Usagi would feel guilty about this whole thing, being torn up about the pain of seeing her friends dealing with the trauma of death, coming back from that. And as she's aware of the pain that she's kind of inflicted on other people, even if for good intentions, she tries to think of a world where no one suffers. We see her want to pursue this world throughout the season, and at the end of the arc, when we get to the future, we would see what those feelings could potentially lead up to. The complicated feelings of trying to protect her friends, trying to make everyone feel good, leads to a future of stagnation. The Dark Moon Clan would be a force of chaotic rebels, here to upend the future status quo, and would be misled by Doom Phantom in the form of Wiseman, a figure of destruction and entropy. However, the future that Usagi creates in the future, the one Chibiusa is there to protect and restore, would be a future of stagnation, where Usagi's will to keep everything safe results in everything becoming unchanging, stale, imprisoned, perfect. A deathless, white world where no one can suffer and thus no one can feel happiness. Usagi would have a choice. Does she change the future or keep it the same? I think Usagi should combat these future horrors being sent back from the Dark Moon Clan and try to think of ways she can keep her friends safe, only to then see the future and kind of put into perspective on things. All the while, she is helping out the Four Sisters from Rubius. As we see in the original anime, the Four Sisters do redeem themselves. I think they should have a redemption arc as well here. But the moment they're brought into the future by Sailor Pluto, they should see that the world Neo Queen Serenity has created is less than perfect. The thing they've been fighting to defend is in fact something of a horror story due to its sterility and inflexibility. I'm imagining something kind of out of the world of the Stepford Wives almost, where everyone is static, everyone's kind of robotic, free will is a myth, and of course the aesthetic of a pure white horizon with all the chromed over grass and all the crystal buildings. There's something soulless about it, something haunting, almost like an abandoned ghost town left to fossilize. At a certain point, Doom Phantom should try to create a time paradox, something that contradicts the future and undoes everything. In this case, I think that should be the death of Mamoru. Again. Now, this would undo the birth of Chibiusa, but paradoxically, also prevent all the events in that season from taking place, which would in turn prevent the death of Mamoru because Wise Man wouldn't be back in time, thus creating a wild paradox that nearly undoes the entire timeline, collapsing all of reality across the eras into a singularity that would obliterate everything. Now, Usagi should prevent this, but in the process, completely rewrite the future. Using her power and the power of Sailor Pluto, they might heal the timeline, but displace Chibiusa entirely from her home and leave the future uncertain while Chibiusa is unanchored. This complete divorce from reality would result in things getting complicated. Chibiusa would be orphaned in time, but also a future where things never die would be undone, opening the door to uncertainty. This is something the original series lacked because the threat of changing the future was always a factor. The future was seen as a positive, something that needs to be preserved. But in this case, the uncertainty of the future adds to everything. Because now that they've seen how one timeline can go, perhaps this time they can make the right choices, or arguably worse ones. Oh yeah, by the way, all that stuff with Diamond where he fetishizes Neo Queen Serenity and tries to dress Usagi, who is again a child, in the outfit of her adult. Yeah, that whole thing, that should be there still, because that's deeply creepy, and it should be played entirely for horror. We should not get anything sympathetic about this guy. He is a monster through and through, and deeply, deeply creepy. And that creepiness, that desperation, should play into his arc. Usagi should be purely horrified. There should be very little pity Usagi has for him. This is a sense where the future is a battle between gray and black. You know, not ethical muddiness versus actual bad guys. Because in this situation, there really is no good answer. You're still preserving the status quo unless you totally break the foundations of the system that led here. Again, not so pleasant. It's a dark concept. And Usagi should grapple with the fact that her powers led to this whole circumstance occurring. And her choice should be to move away from that, to stop abusing her powers, to understand her limitations. Yes, she is incredibly powerful, but the conflict should not be whether or not Usagi can blow up something. The conflict should be, should Usagi use her powers beyond what is absolutely necessary, because there might be genuine negative consequences down the road, and that will inform all the conflicts to follow. Because yes, she is incredibly powerful, but that power can come with a huge drawback, one that negatively affects the rest of reality. Usagi vows to be there for Chibiusa, but now there's a rift between them. One made worse when Usagi sees Black Lady, Chibiusa's transformed adult state at the hands of Wiseman, thirst after Mamoru. Oh yeah, I forgot. Chibiusa has the transformation into Black Lady. Okay, controversial take. I think Chibiusa, after returning from the future, should age in real time. Because this version of the story takes place over a longer period of time, Chibiusa should be Usagi's age physically by the end of the series. In the future, she's frozen as a young girl for centuries, but now she's able to mature gradually afterwards, and that maturity, that change, should be something that was impossible for her in that stagnant, stale future. She's behaving like a child for centuries, but now rapidly, as she grows older, is allowed to become a woman. And this should bring about discomfort, but also it shouldn't be seen as a purely negative thing. Very often in fairy tales or magical girl stories, the prospect of growing up is seen as something bad or negative. But I think this should be seen as a positive, that things have to change in order to become what they are meant to be. Nothing good ever happens from stagnation or refusing to change with time. Okay, third arc. And, you know what? Sailor Moon S is just a dark fantasy. The anime arc starts with Mars seeing a literal vision of the end of all reality, as a Lovecraftian entity burrows out of the earth, bringing utter silence to everything. I feel like Sailor Moon S doesn't need much of a rewrite. It's pretty much the one that requires the least amount of alterations. This arc is just generally dark to begin with. It deals with the ethics of whether or not you should execute a young girl to stop a dark future. To save the world is one life all that much into conflict. The ideas of idealism versus cold logic, as seen with the conflict between the inner and outer guardians. Yeah, the conflicts between Sailor Moon and Sailor Uranus are pretty grim if you think about it, and pretty much in line with ideas often seen in dark fantasy. I don't think we need to add too much here, other than the idea that Sailor Saturn is part cyborg, like she is in the manga, because that's kind of cool. She's brought back to life by her father with cybernetic enhancements, and that's kind of neat. I think it's a cool touch. This should offer a parallel between how Usagi brought her own friends back versus how the bad guys bring Saturn back. I think it's a nice touch, and it kind of emphasizes the idea that we're trying to play with, whether or not you should do something just because you could do something. Yeah, I don't know how much you really need to add or change at Sailor Moon S. That's pretty grim. Of all the arcs, that's kind of proof of that this rewrite is possible. You can make a dark fantasy version of Sailor Moon because they made it. The only change we're saying is make it more Lovecraftian up on top. That's about it. The difference is not whether or not the plot is dark. The difference is the aesthetics of it being dark. The clinical labs are more fun and upbeat in the original series, but we would make it more cold and disturbing. We don't see enough of the cosmic horror until the very end, outside of Ray's visions. Sailor Saturn, despite being the embodiment of entropy and death, rarely shows how dark utter silence and oblivion can be. The visuals are really all that needs to be changed. But once you change that, the S arc goes from another season of Sailor Moon to something genuinely disturbing. I mean, heck, this is a series where the henchmen all kill each other in deeply disturbing ways. Like they remove the car brakes, let the car crash over a ridge. That's pretty dark for a kid's show, I'll tell you that right now. Or they trap inside a television set for the rest of reality. That stuff is dark, like genuinely upsetting. The middle 3 arcs of Sailor Moon, they're directed by the same people who made Utena. They get pretty dark, okay? And they can get dark. Then there's Super S, which, as mentioned before, I think should be made into a circus-themed horror story. But I think it's here that the theme of aging comes back into play. So, remember I mentioned Chibiusa would be aging? Well, by this point 2 years would have passed, and she should physically be older looking. At this point, she's probably going through puberty, and thus is at a crossroads, whether to hold on to the joys of childhood or embrace burgeoning adulthood. And that would be contrasted with Nehelenia's fear of growing old and irrelevant. Now, Nehelenia's arc will still be the same as it is in the show, but, with ties to the Moon Kingdom and all that. But I think Chibiusa getting older might have a good parallel to Nehelenia, in a way that was absent in the original series. Chibiusa has never been allowed to grow up. Nehelenia has never wanted to grow old. In this sense, one path would see aging as a positive, as a way to experience that which you would never be able to otherwise, whereas the other sees aging as oblivion. Like the ruins, Nehelenia fears falling into the oblivion of memory and being forgotten about, crumbling away until all that's left are moss-ridden, empty spaces. In this new version also, Usagi will be turning 18 around this point, graduating high school and moving to university. And it should feel like an ending, like things are reaching a point of no return for all characters involved. The theme of aging, I think, would allow Super S to be elevated, especially as Helios represents the dream of childhood. Can you carry that dream into adolescence, into adulthood, into old age? I think exploring these ideas would really elevate Super S and allow it to be something very profound and meaningful, especially to an audience that at this point would have been aging out of the show they first started watching all those years ago. Also, Chibiusa, she should end her arc with the Amazon Quartet as her personal sailor guardians, to fully complete the idea of the passing of the torch. That should be her sign that she has matured, that she has grown up, that she has become much like her mother, Sailor Moon. I just think that's a good idea, because she won't be going away at the start of the next arc, because there's no future for her to return to. In the original anime, she goes back to the future at the beginning of Sailor Stars. Well, now there's no future to go back to, so she can stick around, take part in the action of the final arc. But yeah, I think the horror element of the creepy clown show and the change of transformation should be a real emphasis on this arc, showcasing not only how the individual can change and either accept it or resist it, but how the world can change too. Changing, age swaps, weird body horror, all of that is a great example of the themes of the story. The fear of growing up, the fear of alteration, the fear of becoming different. And I think Nehelenia could be a much more tragic character in this darker, more gothic retelling of the arc. And yes, she would return in Sailor Stars like she does in the original, but I also feel like she's a figure that ultimately brings about her own ruination due to her refusal to move past her own grudges and past her own refusal to stop the world from changing without her. And also, with Sailor Stars, she would fit in with the rest of the aesthetic of characters who are failures, who have failed in some way and have subjected to their darkest urges in service of Galaxia. But let's get to that right now, shall we? And finally, there's Stars. At this point, we've had Usagi confront the fear of change, aging, and the foreign reaches of existence. So she's probably not looking too great. In the original series, Mamoru leaves for America and disappears because Galaxia gets him on his flight. But here, let's just have him die outright. Have Galaxia be introduced early in the show, killing Mamoru in front of Usagi. Usagi would watch as the one anchor throughout her entire life would be gone, crushed. This is, by the way, the third time Mamoru is dying in this arc, but this time is different because unlike the previous occasions where magic forced Mamoru back to life or where time paradoxes allowed Mamoru to come back, this time he's just dead. And Usagi is now unable to bring him back due to there being no other circumstances outside of her own power. Outside the power intrinsic to the silver crystal, within her brooch, within her, she could cross a line and bring Mamoru back, but doing so might bring about that dark future that she fought to destroy all those years ago. Even if Usagi could bring Mamoru back, which she's not sure she could, she's fearful from her past experiences that if she brought him back, it would cause untold misery to everyone, and in turn create a stable time loop which would end up bringing them all back right to the same place. She's fearful of herself, but also of the pain she's experiencing. She wouldn't want to be like her future self, creating a deathless world of preservation, nor would she want to be like Nehelenia, who refuses to let anything change. But this would bring about the great sadness in her, especially as we see her engage in a fight against an intergalactic threat where her opponents are broken souls much like her. She would see more and more of herself in the eyes of those she fights. The second pillar of her life disappearing, everyone going in different directions, different universities, different paths. Until this point, the characters have all lived generally in the same area, but now distance becomes a factor between them. And not just that, but each of the girls would have seen something awful. They would have been hurt. They would have gone in different paths. Venus might go back to her Sailor V stuff. Ami might go and study to become a doctor. Rei might descend into the darkness of her own supernatural occult studies. And Mako, well, Mako probably will find love, or look for love anyway. She's been chasing heartbreak this whole time. Maybe now's her chance to find someone she truly loves who means something to her. Maybe a guy, maybe it could be Ami. I mean, I ship those two all the time, but I digress. The binds of friendship would be tested, but not broken. One key element of Sailor Moon is that friendship is one of the most powerful forces in the world, and Usagi, just because there's distance between her friends, shouldn't be separate from her friends. This isn't a friendship breakup. It really shouldn't be. They're tested by distance, they're tested by different pulls and pushes, but at the end of the day, they still come together and still deeply love each other. Just because it's dark fantasy does not mean the characters have to be cynical assholes. And in fact, the darkness, that pain, actually puts into contrast how tragic things can be. Because as those binds are tested and they prove firm and strong, if, say, something awful happened to the characters, that would prove really sad, wouldn't it? And Chibiusa, well, she's becoming her own hero, and maybe a few episodes can focus just on her adventures, separate from her mother. Or maybe Usagi recognizing that Chibiusa is her own woman now. There's a lot of cool stuff you can do there, with change, with age, and I think that the support systems that Usagi once held herself up with, we're now seeing things get murky. And what happens when things get murky? You go down a path you didn't expect before. In a sense, Seiya and the Starlights pose a different option, a new path forward. Usagi and Seiya's relationship might have a tinge of rebound to it, but also an escape from the pain in the arms of someone else. Though ultimately, Usagi should not end up with Seiya, as she comes to accept her own feelings of pain and mourning, and deals with them through the proper mourning process, rather than distracting herself in someone else's arms. Likewise, Seiya's need for Usagi should be due in part to her own fear being away from her princess, fearing for her princess's safety. Ultimately, it's an arc about pain and uncertainty in the face of Armageddon, but also about realizing that sometimes a distraction from pain is a good thing to an extent. You can only distract from pain so long before you have to actually address the root of that pain and deal with it. But in that time, you might gain the strength through companionship with someone else to meaningfully confront it. As mentioned before, all the enemies from Nehelenia at the start of the arc to all the various intergalactic Sailor Guardians should be broken figures. I feel like this arc should have fewer fights, even episode to episode, but each fight does have an impact, either on the world or on the relationships between the two characters. We should see the drama, the pain. Nehelenia, for example, would bring the inner and outer Guardians together as University pulls everyone in a different direction. And we'd still have the mirror cracking with the Ice Queen allegory story, the Hans Christian Andersen thing. But then after Usagi saves Mamoru gets killed off. It almost renders that whole conflict meaningless in a way, or rather tragically short-sighted. And perhaps after that, they're forced to battle Galaxia as she tears the planet asunder. I think the final arc should be apocalyptic, more so than the original anime's ending. In the original anime, the last 5 episodes feature Tokyo crumbling with the sky a dark blood red. There's a force from the cosmos that comes down, and nothing Usagi and friends can do can stop it. But that dark tone, I think that should start halfway through the arc and just get worse and worse and worse. Earth shouldn't just be attacked by Galaxia, it should be downright ruined, cracked open like an egg, the contents of the mantle spilling into the sky. The heroes should take the fight to space, and the Guardians will one by one be slain, even the Starlights, until it's only Usagi up against Galaxia. And while I think it would end much the same way, with Usagi reaching out to the inherent goodness in Galaxia, the fight should ultimately be more about Usagi resisting her own growing sense of hopelessness. That even if she wins, what will be left of all that she loves in the process? With everything being crumbled away and destroyed, there is increasingly less and less for her to fight, until it becomes so tempting to submit to the same darkness of chaos that Galaxia, after her fight, submitted to. Also, Chibi Chibi Moon, just Sailor Galaxia Starseed. Otherwise, Uranus and Neptune's fake betrayal would work, because Galaxia would have a Starseed, and that's one of the bleaker parts of the original anime, and we're keeping that. We want to amp up the bleakness. We can't, drop one of the saddest pits of the original series. No way. But how do we end this? The original anime ends on an optimistic note. Usagi beats Galaxia, purges her of chaos, and then uses her power to restore everyone's individual starseed. They're rejuvenated, they're brought back, and the world is brought back to the status quo it was before Galaxia invaded. But this is a dark fantasy. Do I do that? I want these characters to be happy. I really do. Truly, nothing makes me happier than at the end of the series seeing everyone together and smiling and just friendships remaining, because the whole series focuses on those core friendships. But if we're rewriting it as a dark fantasy, we can't do that, because it has to be about decay in some way. There has to be some tragedy here. And we spent the whole series building up to this point that forcing people back from the grave, they're trying to keep things stable and static. It's not good. It's the opposite. So I can't just reverse course at the end of the series and say Usagi brings everyone back, but I also can't leave Usagi in a broken, vastly empty reality where Earth is gone, where all these Guardians are gone, there's no redemption.
I think the saying for this is I'm caught between a rock and a lard face.
Why'd I even do this? Why would I introduce so much darkness into a story about optimism? Because it wasn't structured to be a dark, bleak story. It was structured so that the idea that even in the bleakest of darknesses, when everything seems like it's going against you, you can still pull victory out of defeat. That you are never too far gone, never too forsaken, never pushed too far to pull things back, to recover, to make things good. And this whole dark exercise, all it does is bring into relief that the themes of Sailor Moon only really work in a story that ends with the idea of optimism. And I think it's here that I want to come back to two different things I mentioned earlier, Utena and Madoka. Both Utena and Madoka are obviously dark fantasy, let's be honest. But Utena is a story about growing up, about maturity, about breaking through cycles of abuse and manipulation through systems. I would say Utena, despite having some really bleak visuals at the end, does end optimistically. Anthe Himemiya is able to break free of Akio's cycles of control. Even though it's going to happen again and again and again, she is able to walk away and leave Akio as this sort of car without a key, rusting in place. She comes back to the cycles to save Utena if you kind of see Adolescence of Utena as the follow-up series to the original show, which I do. It's another cycle. That's how I interpret it. But that cycle leads to optimism. Yes, the future is scary, but it's a future where you're free. And likewise with Madoka, Madoka breaks free the cycle of pain, that this cycle of horror is destroyed in some way. And the whole system that led to these magical girls being tortured and turned into witches, she's able to save all of them from suffering, reinventing the universe using incredible power. Well, not everyone is saved, like my girl Sayaka, unfortunately, still has a bad ending. Until the movies come out, it ends on a pretty optimistic note. And we're still waiting for the fourth film, by the way, so I can't say for sure Madoka is totally optimistic. They might pull out some really bleak stuff in that film, but I digress. Sailor Moon, even as a dark story, should still end optimistically, which is why I'm going to have it so none of the characters are actually killed. Once again, starseeds, the soul. Sailor Galaxia harvests them. And once free, the physical bodies rematerialize. You see, at this point, the flesh isn't the thing that matters. It's the spirit, it's the soul. And all these characters have managed to, survive. They've managed to persevere through it all. Their victory means they get to live. I think it would be bleak otherwise. Yes, they have to walk away with the trauma of the fight. They've seen horrible things, but they're still able to rebuild. And I think this offers a good opportunity as well. Maybe, even as the Earth is being destroyed, Usagi uses her powers to keep humanity and life going. Even in a fragmented Earth, she's able to save some of existence. And from there, we get into the future, rebuilding, recreation. You can't stop what happened, but you can move beyond it, where she can rebuild, create her moon kingdom where things are maybe not perfect, learn the lessons from what you have to learn from them, but can be better. I think if in this exercise we figured out a few things, that Sailor Moon really worked as a Magical Girl series because it focused on hope. While it was dark at times, it never lost sight that the trauma, that the pain was always passing, and that the value of love and friendship was eternal, that stuck around. And that's a good message for kids, it's a good message for girls. And I think defying that kind of loses track of what made this show so special in the first place. Again, this is a fun little exercise, but you know what? Maybe when you write your dark stories yourself, your dark fantasies, or if you write a optimistic childish story, you keep in mind that by changing the formula too much, you might throw out of alignment the very themes that resonate with the audience receiving them.